Rear suspension work, day number 1. This is recorded on April 24th of 2005. A stock car racing mechanic we have at the Public Works Garage, Bob Schmidt, has a Chevelle rear end and a Turbo 350 tranny that he is parting out and will let me have for a decent price. The Chevelle rear is what I have in the other 36, and I like the width of the rear and the 4-point triangulated castings in the housing that are designed for a rear suspension I am contemplating. A fellow by the name of Trees with his 36 down in Tennessee has this type of suspension, and it looks really solid. The only trick will be getting the angled members with the right hardware to match the castings on the Chevelle rear end. Rear suspension work, day number 2. This is recorded on June 5th of 2005. What Bob Schmidt eventually gave me for the rear end and tranny turned out to be my full rear suspension with a rear end, tranny, and drive shaft. Another hero who will now get mentioned on the acknowledgments page. Thanks, Schmitty. Big time. I got the pressure washer out this weekend and cleaned up the rear and the tranny. I got the rear cross member off the old Chevelle frame that Bob gave me and wire brushed it up too. I set it into the place on the frame and had a hard time getting control measurements to work out. The different curvature of the rear wheel hump of the frame was causing the stamped metal of the rear cross member to distort. I finally picked up on a small hole close to the upper spring mount on the cross member as a control point and locked everything in. I placed about 10 1-inch beads of weld to secure the cross member. That may sound like a lot, but the stamped metal would deform otherwise while I was using it in mock-up. I pinned the upper swing arm and pulled in things to the ride height with a couple of cable come-alongs in the rear frame member. I called Feist to ask where he picks up the 3-degree of pinion angle I need at the ride height. He got me straightened out, and I'll pull this off the front yoke casting itself for the rear end. Rear suspension work, day number 3. This is recorded on June 7th of 2005. After today, I'm not sure if I'll be able to get this rear end system to work. There may be a chance that with some appropriate coil-over shocks, I might get things to fit. I got the angle finder tool I need to set the pinion angle and located the lower bar points from the ride height. I need at least. I cut the connector points out of the old Chevelle frame and fit them to work on the channel of the 36 frame. I was really happy with how I lucked out on fitting these parts together. I tacked them into place, then fought with come-alongs to get the springs installed and everything pinned together. Once there, the ride height was 5 inches too high, and the axle was about 2 inches too far forward from the radius of the lower connector arm. I got on top of the assembly to jump up and down, but the rear assembly would only move down about 2 inches max. Time to get with Feist, Scotty, Schmitty, Trees, and the rest to see what they think about this. Also, the pinion angle is now -4 degrees. None of this is going to work right. So on the next day, 6/8 of 05, I checked with Scotty, and he thinks there might be some more weight in the rear part of the truck than I think. He thinks that things might just settle in. Schmitty thought the cross member should be reset, but he also thought that the coilovers might work with the current configuration. He said he would bring in some springs that he uses that might work better. He said that if these work, he could put me onto his supplier. Both Schmitty and Scott thought I might also try cutting out a coil of the existing spring and see how that lines out. But Schmitty warned about how much harder the rear end would ride after such a cut. I have my springs for the Mustang II front suspension. From my recollection at least, they may have a configuration that might bring these down closer to what is needed. I might try it tonight to see how that would work on the rear suspension. Rear suspension, day number 4. This was recorded June 12th of 2005. I took the rear cross member off and refabbed the connection ends for the frame so the X member would fit lower onto the frame channels. This made for a more stock configuration of the X member by making the face fit more into the vertical alignment. I got the X member to fit and tacked it in with a few welds. I then checked, double-checked, and many times over-checked the position of the axle with the plumb bobs via measurements from the front axle position before I tacked in or welded the front of the lower bar mounts to the frame. The front of the lower bars are now in a new configuration. The top of the connection point flange is now on the bottom web of the channel that comprises the frame. After the cross member and the lower bars were tacked into place, I then found that I had lost my 3 degrees of upward pinion angle to match the motor shaft, drive shaft angle at ride height. I left the lower bars positioned and removed the cross member welds again and moved it farther back on the frame by about an inch. Leaving the lower bars locked, I kept the wheelbase position lined up on the frame where it needed to be. By positioning the cross member back farther, the differential rocked back into the 3-degree pinion angle like a cradle. I re-welded the cross member at this point to the frame. Okay, I'm feeling a little better about this rear end progress at this point, but I will still have some hurdles to overcome. Control-wise, I was able to get the rear end mounted properly, and height movement will not cause the rear end to move laterally forward or aft on the frame as much now. I checked this like trees did by moving the rear end to the most top position, then down to the bottom. Everything moved freely and nothing was in a bind. By lowering the low bottom arms, the arc of the radii formed by the length of the arms are much closer to the vertical configuration, and thus the rear does not move forward or back in the full range of motion and affecting the wheelbase substantially. This will force the rear wheels to stay within an area of the rear fenders irrespective of their vertical position during operation. I am not happy with how the front and the lower bars now attach into the frame. I'm considering lengthening the lower arms so that the mounts project into the X member of the frame. This will give a stronger mounting point for the lower bars of the rear suspension and things to mount up into the plane of the frame in lieu of below it. The only thing that concerns me here is whether there is enough strength on the hold X brace of the frame to hold the rear end mounting. I will check with Scotty, Feiss, and Schmitty on their thoughts about this potential issue. Now I need to try to get to the point loads of the rear tires of my 36 and give this width, the ride height of the springs to an expert to see if I can get springs that'll fit the rear end configuration. If that is not possible, I guess I'll look into some coilovers to set this thing up. Rear suspension work, day number 5. This is recorded June 15th of 2005. I lengthened the lower bars of the rear end to place the forward mounts into the X brace of the frame. I bought some 1 by 3 by 1/8 inch thick rectangular tubing to accomplish these extensions. Everything is just tacked in place for mock-up purposes now. I checked the travel and everything moves freely to the frame and about 3 inches lower than ride height. I think this will be fine. I am much happier with the mount locations now, and I'm considering some reinforcement for the X-brace members of the old frame where these forward lower bars mount and connect up. Rear suspension work, day number 7. This is dated December 23rd of 2005. I painted the frame in mid-November. It's been too cold outside to paint some of the remaining suspensions parts, but it was warm enough outside today. Since I was done with wrapping Mama's Christmas gifts, I was able to paint the rest of the associated parts as well. Then I bolted on the rear end up to the frame.